Hi everyone, Dan Gunner from Insane Forensics. Welcome back to Tech Talk Tuesday. Today what we're going to talk about is the Department of Defense's joint targeting cycle and how it can improve your threat hunting. So let's hop right into it. So we're going to start by assuming that you don't know much about the joint targeting cycle. Maybe you're not prior military, and that's fine. Probably most of watching won't know what it is. So starting out, it's a 6-phase iterative cycle that comes from Joint Pub 360. It's a very long military publication that goes through how the military does targeting between branches, so Army, Navy, Marines, also between domains, so land, sea, air. At the end of the day, when you're planning an operation in the military, it's not just about one domain, it's about many. Just like when you're planning a threat hunt, and we'll see as we talk on the threat hunting side of this, just like when you're talking about a threat hunt in your organization, it's not just about one department, one part of the network, one type of asset. But what the joint targeting cycle does, as I said, is focus on that entire scope of the operation and specifically the purpose. It's a process that's designed both for deliberate planned targets, so those targets that you know you're going after, but also those dynamic targets, the opportunistic targets, the targets you didn't know were going to be in the environment that are there. And, when you think of threat hunting, it's the same way, right? You might go out and you might say, hey, we're going to hunt for APT-29. And then as you're doing the hunt, you say, okay, we're looking for APT-29 tactics. Hey, I'm starting to see APT-34 tactics. I'm starting to see tactics of insider threat. The good thing is what the joint targeting cycle does for the military that can also, we'll see, help with the threat hunting side, is it's built in with that ability to stay flexible. The other thing to note is it's not time constrained or rigidly sequential. And so a lot of people, they hear process and they're like, oh, that sounds like it's going to take away the creative factor. It's going to take away from those wins that we weren't planning on getting. That's not necessarily correct. You can have a deliberate process and still have room left in for kind of finding those wins that you weren't expecting to find. So quick overview, joint targeting cycle, the 6 steps. So it starts out with commander's intent. At the end of the day, for a military operation or for a threat hunt, there's some reason you're doing that. A lot of times it's a business reason, right? Are you worried about insider threat? Are you worried about, an APT group? With the military, it's the same way, right? Why are we going to spend millions of dollars on this military operation? And at the end of the day, what is the commander hoping that will achieve out of this? That's the first stage from that. Once you have that commander's intent, the next thing in the joint targeting cycle is the target development and prioritization. So at this phase, this is where they really break down and they say, hey, this group that we're going after, we're going to go after X part of it. And on the next slide, we'll actually see an example specific for oil and gas that breaks this down. But in phase 2, they're saying, okay, well, the target we're looking at looks like this, it's built like this, these are kind of the components. And what that does, once you have that picture, is then you match, after you have all the components and kind of that map diagrammed out, you do your capabilities analysis, right? So for the military, this thing's like F-35s, like what bombs and missiles you use, do you send the Navy, like what are we actually going to go send out to prosecute this target? Once you have a plan through there, it actually goes back to say, okay, we're going to go back to the commander and say, give us a yes, no, and this is the force we need, or these are the resources we need to do this, right? So force assessment is an alignment, is that alignment of resources. At step 4 in this cycle, what you're doing is you're getting that buy-in. In step 5, you're actually going out and conducting the operation. So in a threat hunt, this would be where you actually do the hunt itself. And then in step 6, you're saying, how did I actually do on this? The military, they call it a hot wash. You can see the arrow actually keeps going. So this is an iterative cycle that's used to plan military operations. As I said, when we talked about that target system analysis, this process works with complex systems. So this is another diagram from JP360. The diagram here on the left shows different components of oil and gas. This straight out of the publication. So when they're planning these things, they could say, well, what does a crude well provide, right? What do the kerosenes provide? What's that lubricant plant? And, for a military targeter, they're looking at what are those choke or what are those pressure points that we're going to do, right? And, this is very much an offensive approach. And, it actually works out quite well for threat hunting. So let's hop right into that. So a few years ago, a colleague, Mark Seitz, and I, we wrote a paper for SANS called a Practical Model for Conducting Cyber Threat Hunting. The links on the slide, we'll also put it down in the box below for this. And just for the same reasons, what this paper is designed to do is avoid a lot of those common biases and mistakes that you make with threat hunting. And it adapts in a lot of those concepts from that joint targeting cycle and applies them to threat hunting. So if you look here on the left, what we have is the diagram for the threat hunt model that we talk about a lot in the paper. And again, it starts with that first phase of purpose. Why are you even threat hunting? And a lot of people, they say, well, why wouldn't I just start with hypothesis, right? And if you start with hypothesis, the challenge is you're actually starting you're kind of past that plan review to where when you start with hypothesis, you're starting with a starting with a very specific, kind of set of assumptions on what your purpose is and where you're actually going to look. With this model, again, with purpose, what we challenge people to do and what we worked with companies to help them do is say, why are you threat hunting in the first place, right? And it could be, right? It could be reasons like, hey, we are looking for APT29, for APT34, we're looking for insider threat. Or it could be down to kind of what you see with a lot of the solutions that start with hypothesis generation is, it could be a threat hunt of, hey, we know SMBs open to the internet. Have we seen people use 17010 or another SMB vuln against us? But with this model, again, it starts with purpose, both the purpose of your technical program, but also the purpose of maybe senior leadership there. Once you have purpose, it goes into scope. And so just like we talked about with the joint targeting cycle, it's going to start with, okay, we have the purpose. Now, what parts of our organization are we going to look at? If we're a small organization, you might not have ground to cover. If you're a big organization, if you're an industrial asset owner, you might have multiple plants. And so you might have to say, well, what power plant are we going to start with? What, refinery are we actually going to start with, and why? And it leads down into then, okay, we have our site. Well, what are the components at that site, right? So like at the last slide, we talked about the oil and gas example where for targeting, they break it down into components. You'll want to do the same kind of component breakdown here because what it's going to challenge you to do is really think critically about what's in your environment. And also in this step, it's all about your environment, right? We aren't to that next step equipping. And why we're doing that is we don't want people to just think about the one hammer they have today, right? You don't want to plan a hunt that you can't do, but you also don't want to bias your hunts around just having, just using the one tool that you're used to using. So you do your scope, you take apart kind of the area that you're going to do your hunt in. You do that equip phase, and then you figure out, okay, this is the data we have, this is the data we don't have. These are the resources we have to analyze it. This is what we need to close the gaps. If we had these extra resources, well, then we could support these other hunting hypotheses. And what this does, and the strength of this model, is trying to get you to really have a plan before you start pulling data and going. After the equip phase, you go into plan review. So again, this is where in the joint targeting cycle, this was when you were getting commander buy-in and resourcing and all this. And in this phase, it's pretty much the same. And so in plan review here, this is where you might say, okay, yeah, we do have all the resources. We need to do this. We have everything lined up. We're good to go. Other checks that might happen here is things like legal review. So we worked with people that employed the model. They got to this phase and they actually realized that a part of their threat hunt was illegal. They couldn't do it. They didn't have the right legal paperwork in place for what they were planning on doing. So in this case, this actually prevented them from kind of some legal trouble if they would have moved forward with it. But after plain review, hopefully your hunt gets approved, or you make the changes that need to go forward. Then you actually go to execute. This is where you pull the data, analyze the data, write the report. Finally, feedback. So another really important part of mature threat hunting programs is this feedback stage, right? So what did we do well? What didn't go well? What can we do better next time? What, would be nice to have? What did we learn about ourselves along the way? As you can see here, we also have dash lines in the center. So just as with the joint targeting cycle, we said, hey, it's not always necessarily sequential. You could jump between, and specifically here for these lines, it's also saying, hey, your feedback should cover every step. So your feedback might be, hey, when we were going out to start this hunt, we didn't get a lot of good concrete guidance to start out. And so, someone didn't like the end product because the spec that we got coming in wasn't good. That might be a valid criticism of the purpose phase. So this is the SANS paper there. It dives a lot deeper into each step and each step along the way. This was kind of a quick overview of it. So thanks for joining in. Keep in touch, and we hope to see you next week.